Good evening, and welcome to the Russian Revolution Analyst Desks, or the RRAD, because you know we're pretty rad.
Tonight we'll be overviewing the whole Russian Revolution from top to bottom. Aaron and I will be talking about it here on the desk, while our field reporter, Irwin will be reporting from us live from time to time. How's the weather up there, Irwin?
It's gonna rain!
Thanks, Irwin, and let us begin, shall we?
Karl Marx, the father of communism, born in 1818.
Marx is the man behind Das Kapital, which is basically the Bible of communism. The idea of putting the nation's economy first, destroying the class system, both are part of Marxism, which is Marx's ideas.
Marx believed that the communism would develop on its own due to the daily struggle of economic existence. After all, he believed the people had no need for administration.
The man did believe that the true history of man could finally begin when his ideals were actually being used, which is pretty ridiculous seeing as he had no practical way of putting them to use.
Interestingly enough, he felt there would be stages of society before his ideal society would be in place, the capitalist and the socialist era, both consisting of factors that directly go against Marxism.
On top of all that, his ideas were so general, and all of these things are supposed to naturally develop for the economic crisis.
So, Russia is led by a czar named Nicholas II. He was put into power in 1894. He had 5 children and was one of the weakest leaders Russia has ever seen.
Well, for one, when Father Gapon led a group of unarmed and harmless protesters to the Tsar's palace to ask about improving work conditions for the workers, Nicholas responded by mowing down the protesters, including Gapon, with a fatal rain of bullets from the Imperial Guards. This showed how terrible Nicholas handled problems. We go now to Irwin, who was at the scene of the Bloody Sunday. How's it going down there, Irwin?
Everybody dead!
Thanks, Irwin. The Tsar decided to call war versus Japan in 1904. They were a way smaller country with not nearly as many people as Russia. This would last until about September 1905, and Russia would then go on to lose the war after, which made Russia look very bad. People would go on to start and doubt the Tsar and his poor choices that he continued to do. We go down to Irwin, who had just arrived on the war scene. Irwin?
Help me! Thank you, Irwin. This is Bloody Sunday caused the creation of the October Manifesto, which was issued by the Tsar late in 1905. It promised political reformation after 10 long months of continuous striking by workers. This also made him create a political party known as the Duma.
Let's step back a little bit to talk about how a man by the name of Gregory Rasputin, a mad monk who believed he could hear God, he was approached by Alexandra, the Tsar's wife.
That's right, she was desperate to find a healer for her wounded son, Tsarevich Alexei. Her son had been diagnosed with an injury that caused him painful bleeding called hemophilia B. There was no cure for this sickness. Rasputin prayed for her son, and for the next morning, Alexei showed significant signs of healing, a true miracle.
Anyways, the Duma was created, but it had little to no effect on making decisions in Russia, because they were overruled by the Tsar. If they made a choice, he didn't like it, and he wouldn't close the meeting and hold a new one later.
The Tsar made another horrible decision and decided it would be a good idea for him to go and lead the Russian army in World War I. In his absence, Rasputin was put in charge of the Duma.
Rasputin had no political background whatsoever and was the worst thing that could have happened. Rasputin would remove members from the Duma and replace them with his own friends, who knew nothing about nothing that was going on. It was a complete disaster.
Rasputin needed to be stopped, and someone had to do it fast. But first, we go down to Irwin, who's about to conduct an interview with Rasputin. Irwin?
He did!
Okay, I'll slow it down for a minute. There was a man named Felix Yusupov who had married the only niece of the Tsar. He invited over Rasputin for some wine and cakes. Yusupov had laced the cakes and wine with very strong cyanide. Rasputin would go on to eat and drink, but to no avail. The poison failed. This would have killed any other man, but not Rasputin.
Yusupov would then go upstairs to find a revolver. He went back downstairs and sat beside Rasputin and shot him. The bullet traveled through the stomach and the liver, but that did not kill Rasputin. Rasputin would then stumble up the stairs and out to the open courtyard, but he wasn't alone. Yusupov was close behind and launched 2 more bullets into the mad monk. Both were fatal, and Rasputin collapsed in front of the gate. Both shots were fatal, but when Rasputin's body made a movement, Yusupov put a bullet through Rasputin's head. Then they took him to the river and dumped him into the lake under Bolshiye-Provodsky Bridge. His body was found a few days later. Let's take a second to talk about Alexander Kerensky and the Provisional Government. Both of them became major factors in the February-March Revolution.
With the Tsar out of power and nobody in charge of Russia, a provisional government was made until a real government could be elected.
A few days after the provisional government was established, the Tsar was abdicated, putting him out of power and the provisional government in. 2 months later, the first coalition came into power, and with it, Alexander Kerensky.
One of the common misconceptions is that Kerensky was always the leader of the provisional government, when it was actually Prince George Lvov, then Kerensky. Later on, the second coalition came into power, and as of July 24th, 1917, Kerensky was no longer Minister of War, but Prime Minister.
Both Kerensky and Lvov had similar ideas, the biggest and most impact one being that Russia may stay firm in the international obligations, including wars.
In my opinion, that was a good idea, seeing as it gives Russia allies overseas.
Yeah, but it also, spoiler alert, was the reason the government was overthrown.
The decision to stay in the war wasn't just made by the provisional government, it was also decided upon by the Petrograd Soviet of Workers along with the decision to carry on as a democracy. The provisional government was also released political prisoners, legalized political parties, and introduced the right to strike and an 8-hour-long working day.
Those were good changes, yeah, but they did nothing to provide the peasantry with the land. On top of that, Kerensky and Lvov thought the Russian people would be willing to fight for a free and democratic Russia when the Tsar was gone.
Kerensky was too focused on Russia surviving as a democracy when all the Russian people wanted peace, bread, and land.
There were three main groups that occupied Russia at this time. First, there were the Mensheviks. They were a socialist movement that emerged in 1904. They were a less radical party and expected change to naturally happen. There were also the Bolsheviks that were led by Lenin. They were a communist party, and they were all about getting change now and violently with their own hands.
Let's not forget about the bourgeoisie, who were the rich people that occupied Russia. They opposed communism and wanted capitalism to stand and nothing to change. But Lenin had other ideas, didn't he?
Lenin created his own theory known as Leninism, a creative name, I know. He believed that there needed to be a party in the way of the capitalist government or the vanguard of the proletarian. Politics over economics were also a very important key to success as well.
He had one goal, to seize power of Russia and reshape it in the form of communism, and to push it worldwide. To also keep a dictator because he did not believe the working class could hold a communist state. He did not wait for the economic crisis. He wanted it to be naturally implemented through revolution.
He also created the April Theses. It was broken down into several main key points. It was called for an immediate revolution, a violent and fast one. It was almost promised peace to all who helped fight for communism. They were to take the land from the rich aristocrats of Russia and divide it evenly among the people. The power of the government was to be also given to the common people known as the Soviets. Finally, they were to seize all the factories and make it all one big, massive company.
He also had a 4-word catchphrase that could be heard all over Russia: peace, bread, and land. Those 3 things are what he promised to every single individual who helped him fight for communism. And coincidentally, those 3 things are what people wanted most of all. So it was a very convincing act for people to hop on the so-called hype train. But
Lenin didn't play nice. He had a secret force called the Cheka. They would go and torture any person who stood against Lenin. This played a crucial role during the Civil War because they would go and scare people into supporting Lenin instead of helping the White Army, which we will be talking about later. They were known for their brutality as well as their sense of no remorse.
Before that, Lenin would lead the November Revolution. He went directly after Alex Kerensky and the ineffective provisional government. Lenin would lead his Red Army into the government's building and arrest their leaders, as well as the Tsar being under house arrest. The provisional government would then surrender to Lenin and his men. Lenin could not be stopped.
The Tsar would abdicate on behalf of him and his son, and then his families were all thrown in jail. They were later executed in 1918 by the Bolsheviks.
Talk about the civil war that happened afterwards. The other Russians and the rest of the world were not going to take this lying down. They wanted to get rid of Lenin and stop the growth of communism before it leaked out to the rest of the world. The White Army was forced by troops from every part of the world and hired mercenaries and combined to fight Lenin and his Red Army. But they weren't prepared. This was called the Allied Intervention.
The Red Army was a lot smaller than the White Army, but they had very important advantage. They were organized. Lenin and Trotsky led them with passion and intelligence, while the White Army had no formal leadership and was very unorganized. Everyone was fighting for a different reason, and many of them quarreled, while the Red Army was all on the same page and fought for the same reasons, to allow communism to wash over Russia.
Civil war would last until 1922. The Red Army would capture key points in key cities all around Russia, and in 1922, the Provisional Government and the White Army was demolished. Lenin had prevailed over all odds and became the lone leader of Russia.
So 4 years after the Civil War, Lenin dies of a cerebral hemorrhage. turns out that he wrote a final testament referring to Stalin that should not be allowed to rise to power over Russia. The battle was between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Stalin was the general security of the party's Central Committee in 1922. He had no regard of human life and a brutal man nonetheless.
The other man is Leon Trotsky. He was the leader of the Red Army under Lenin's direction. He is who should have become the leader of Russia if the testament had been read. But Stalin threw it away. Stalin won over the people, and because Trotsky was of Jewish descent, and the Soviets did not like that, as soon as Stalin rose to power, he ended up deporting and exiling Trotsky from Russia. Stalin had officially gained power over all of Russia. We now go to Irwin, who's conducting an interview with Stalin himself. Irwin?
I'm gonna let you finish, but Stalin's the greatest man on this planet, comrade.
Well, that was interesting. Anyways, that's all the time we have for today. I guess you could say it's a load of Bolshevik. Until next time, this is Aaron Boak and Daylan signing off.